was unlikely. My mom told him, "I'm sorry, but it's not going to happen." And he laughed, because what are you going to say to the mother who gave you that name? We have a cousin named James. James was Jimmy his entire life. He tried the switcheroo on us too. Only after a few months of telling JD telling us that his name was Jason, he came to Frederick to visit when Jimmy was there. He kept saying, "Jimmy this and Jimmy that," and we said, "Wait a minute. If he can't be James, then you can't be Jason." I still remember his response, a sweet, humble grin, and then, "Yeah, I get it, you're right." And from then on, it was okay to call him whatever you wanted, no matter who says differently. Even Jimmy, who insists on being called James, told him, "I'll call you Jason, but I'm putting your number in my cell phone as JD." All of his military buddies knew him as Hunt. That's what you do in the Army. You talk in acronyms, tell time in quadruple digits, and call each other by your last names. Hunt was the same quiet guy that he was his entire life. Yet he was very responsible, and I continued to hear from his fellow comrades that you never expected trouble with Hunt. While in Iraq with the 3rd ID, JD was known as the quiet kid who loved video games, and he told us that late-night Guitar Hero tournaments or Call of Duty games would converge in his room. JD, or Hunt, excuse me, was nearly undefeated in Guitar Hero. We worried every single day when he was in Iraq for those 15 months. In fact, if the phone would ever ring after 10 o'clock at night, my heart would sink and I'd get an immediate knot in my stomach. And you can imagine what kind of an earful those who dialed the wrong number, or perhaps a brave telemarketer, might have gotten. But JD found his calling. He loved the Army. Mostly he loved his new brothers in arms and the friendships he was forming and the camaraderie that comes with serving together. Hunt was an infantryman. He drove Bradleys in Iraq. Hunt found a calling that encompassed his selfless spirit. As his 3-year enlistment was coming to an end in the middle of the war, in the middle of the desert, Hunt raised his right hand and dedicated himself to 6 more years of service in the Army. When JD finally came home safely in 2009, we were so relieved. He requested to be transferred to Fort Hood, which is much closer to Oklahoma and to all of us. It's about a 6-hour drive from Fort Hood to TIPTON. He came to Fort Hood in the spring of 2009 and was planning to buy a house there. He quickly learned that his new unit with the 1st Cavalry Division at Fort Hood was deployed and he was to join up with them as part of their rear detachment unit. He was going back to Iraq just months after being home. And because Hunt did his job, he didn't complain much and prepared to go back to the war in Iraq again. On November 5th, 2009, JD was filling out paperwork and getting immunizations for his 2nd deployment to Iraq. At 1:34 p.m., a gunman wearing the same uniform as my brother and everyone else in the building opened fire and began shooting. Within an hour, 31 people were wounded and 13 were dead. Of the 31 wounded, Patrick was one of them. Of the 13 dead, JD was one of them. November 5th remains the most horrible day of our entire lives. As we watched the events unfold on TV, we were panicked, yet confident that Fort Hood was an enormous Army base, and the odds of JD being at that place at that time were very slim. After 8 hours of worrying and dozens of phone calls, my mother was visited by the 2 people a soldier's parents never want to see at their doorstep, a casualty assistance officer and a chaplain, informing her that her son, Specialist Jason Dean Hunt, was killed in the Fort Hood shooting that day. I was on the phone with my mom while she was in her house in Frederick, Oklahoma that night, which is 15 miles from here. I will never forget the echo of the officers' voices over the phone and the pain in my mom's cry. Telling my dad over the phone also remains the most painful phone call I've ever made. JD survived a dangerous deployment in a war zone, defending and fighting for our freedom, only to be murdered within months of his return. We could not believe it. In fact, we did what I have learned all Gold Star families do when they're visited by two people in uniform. We think they've made a mistake. There's no way they're talking about my JD. This happens to other people, not him. Yet we heard his name on the news. We attended the National Cemetery, met the President of the United States, saw his picture in the obituary, but we were still hoping that someone would tell us they had the wrong Hunt. It was not until I saw my little brother in a coffin that I had to accept that he was gone. Yet still I asked that they remove his white gloves so that we could see the scar on his hand that he had from his burn accident from our wood-burning stove as a baby. And it was there. The outpouring of support has been very comforting to our family. However, we will always mourn JD's tragic death. If you knew JD, you knew a quiet, sweet young man who thought about everyone but himself. The day after he was killed, the media tried to find people to answer questions about him. When they called here, TIPTON High School, asking for Jason Hunt, nobody knew who they were talking about. Oh, JD, yes, we know JD here. If you knew Jason, you knew a man who was establishing his independence and wanted to earn your respect. And if you knew Specialist Hunt, you knew a brother-in-arms who would give his life for you, and did. We all knew the same person. It really doesn't matter if you call him JD or Jason or Hunt, because we're all calling him a hero. As I folded the bunting that you see along the fence that was lent to me by the McKinney, Texas Fire Department, I reflected on my brother's life. Each of the 23 bunting you see represents a year of his life. As I folded the first few, I thought about my brother as a baby. I remember him scooting across the floor and playing Nintendo in his diapers. As I folded a few more, I thought about his Ninja Turtle teeth and his sweet white hair. When I folded the 16th and 17th and 18th bunting, I reflected on TIPTON High School and his friends here and our great small town that we grew up in. When I folded the 19th bunting, I had to pause and really reflect on the enormous amount of change that he experienced as he turned from a teenager to a young infantryman in the United States Army. The 21st bunting I folded reminded me of the Twinkies in Iraq that I sent him, and a brave young man re-enlisting in the military in the middle of a desert. And the 23rd bunting was the most difficult to fold because it represents the birthday he didn't live to have. I'm going to close my remarks with a letter I received just a few days ago. It's from a very close comrade of JD's, Sergeant Ernie Odell. He was part of the 3rd ID of Fort Stewart that JD deployed with. He spent 15 months in the desert with them, and we were so grateful that JD was surrounded by his family in the military when he was away from us. Though I wanted to hover and protect him his entire life, he was a strong man who was surrounded by his military family. Sergeant Odell could not make it here today, but said he would be honored if I would share his letter. It reads, I can still remember it to this day. The day was like another day, a hot, sticky day in Georgia in the summer of 2006. We had just returned from lunch. Staff Sergeant Forsyth and I were in the platoon area. Then the charge of quarters runner, a young specialist, came in and said we had new soldiers and we were getting first pick, for we had the least amount in the platoon. This was the day I would meet the shy, quiet kid from Oklahoma. Who would know that this young man would do whatever needed done without question, would change my life forever. I asked Hunt. That's what everyone in the Army do. We use their last names. I asked Hunt if he had any mechanical skills. He responded, a little, Sergeant. I said, how would you like to be a Bradley driver? He just looked and smiled. Then I introduced him to the platoon sergeant at the time, Staff Sergeant Forsyth. Finally that day, young Private Hunt was officially in the herd, 3rd Platoon, Bravo Company, 3rd Battalion of the 7th Infantry. JD was a soldier you could always count on. He never asked why or